Hi, I'm John Elizondo, and this is Launchpad.
We need to be smart of how we build communities and how we protect ourselves against natural hazard events such as floods.
That insight comes from Dr. Marcio Giacomoni. He teaches civil and environmental engineering at UT San Antonio, and he's featured in this episode. He helps us answer the question, how does our past help us prepare for the next 100-year flood? If you enjoyed this conversation, make sure you subscribe right now so you don't miss any new episodes. Let's get started. Flash Flood Alley is one of the most dangerous regions in North America, stretching from Dallas down to the Hill Country, into San Antonio, and then westward. For more than a century, this region has unleashed devastating flooding. Each event has inspired policy and structural changes to prevent future disasters. Joining us today is Dr. Marcio Giacomoni, who will enlighten us more about flooding from an engineering perspective. Dr. Giacomoni, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, John. Pleasure to be here.
Well, we're excited to have you here today, and I know we're going to talk about something that is very important, but I do want to lighten the mood to start. You are not from the United States.
No, I'm not.
Where are you originally from?
So I'm originally from Brazil, south of Brazil specifically. And I came to the United States in 2008 to do my PhD. I ended up meeting a Texan, my wife, Laura, and then we came to San Antonio, joined UTSA in 2013.
Where did the motivation and curiosity to study engineering in relation to water come from?
Yeah, so after I'd done my civil engineering degree and my master's, I started working as a consultant, which was great. It was an amazing experience to be able to bring all knowledge that we spent years learning to solving real problems for real communities, So I was doing work for water utilities, wastewater work. I was designing stormwater drainage systems and all that. But after a couple of years, given my age and what I was doing, I realized that I was ready to go abroad and have a different experience. I want to live somewhere else, learn a different language, experience different cultures. And I thought, well, to do that, a lot of Brazilians actually take a sabbatical year and they go backpacking in Europe, for instance. They go work for 6 months washing dishes or whatever, and they raise some money and travel for 6 more months and come back. I thought, well, that's an opportunity. I could do that. Or maybe I could go somewhere else and someone will pay me to do a PhD. It will be a little longer than a year. And the worst case scenario, I will go back to my old job and charge double because I will have an advanced degree or something like that.
So that decision brings you to Texas, and specifically this area known as Flash Flood Alley. Did you know that coming to Texas? Was that something that was already top of mind, something that you eventually realized, oh, I'm doing this research and wow, there's this entire region that I can look back at the history of it and learn ways to improve it?
Yeah, absolutely. When I came to Texas, it was clear to me that Texas was a great place to do what I do because we have not only some of the highest and more intense extreme events, both on the spectrum of droughts and long-term periods of no rain at all, associated with extremely high rates of population growth. We also observe some of the highest, the most intense storm events, not only due to hurricane season, but naturally, Flash Flood Alley, as you mentioned, is one of the places that historically has always seen extreme flood events that happen extremely fast. So as a researcher, I feel like that I'm an amazing place to do what I do.
So why is it called Flash Flood Alley, and what are the characteristics of this area that allows it to be more extreme than other parts of the country?
It's a combination of multiple factors, The first one is the fact that we are so close to sources of moisture, specifically the Gulf of Mexico, right? Naturally, those bodies of water, they observe a lot of heat from the sun and they evaporate a lot of water. And that moisture eventually moves inland, causing some of those extreme events. This is one aspect. The other aspect is the natural topography and geology of the region. The hill country, it's characterized by very narrow creeks and valleys, right, with some topography. We don't have mountains, but we have hills that are made mostly of limestone. Those are rocks with very little permeability. So when it rains, a lot of the rain becomes surface runoff almost immediately, right? It tends to reach creeks and small channels extremely fast, and because of the slope, it starts moving faster and faster, and that's when you observe that type of phenomena called flash flood.
Like putting a Hot Wheel on a track that is basically sloped straight down. I mean, you're going fast.
That's right. Another analogy might be, think of a skiing, right? The more steep, the faster it goes, right? So water tends to accumulate fast in some of those rivers, and it can create catastrophic consequences for people and communities that live in the hill country.
You mentioned the hill country, but I think what's even more surprising, I think, to residents here in San Antonio is that San Antonio is on a slope. It might not feel that way, but this city is built on a slope. And so there are areas of town where you can tell where there have been infrastructure built. I think of the Olmos Dam off of 281, where there have been tragedies that have caused infrastructure to be put in place to avoid those kind of situations.
Yeah, absolutely. And San Antonio is, I think we need to somehow be mindful of how our leaders in the past understood that problem and acted on. In order to protect the Riverwalk, which is such a marvelous, part of town and infrastructure, early city officials realized that we will need flood control infrastructure to protect against those large events that we see, not only due to flash flooding, rain, but also the hurricane season, right? So they early on built Olmos Dam as one type of a reservoir that would store a lot of water when it rains a lot, and when it's storing that water, it releases the water in a slow rate. And a lower rate means less water depth, which means less flooding, right? So the Olmos Dam is one example. On the Salado Creek, we have several smaller reservoirs that were built as well. But not only that because the city kept growing, and more growth means more imperviousness, and more imperviousness means more runoff. Eventually, the city realized that only Olmos Dam and those reservoirs were not enough, right? So then, with the help with the Army Corps of Engineers, San Antonio built 2 flood control tunnels that actually divert water from the San Antonio River and the San Pedro Creek River, or the San Pedro Creek, under the downtown and releases back downstream, right? So for people that have been, for instance, near the Pearl, there is a park north of the Pearl by the river where there's some kind of different weird infrastructure. It looks like a wall with some grates, metal grates, and that actually is the inlet of the tunnel. It's raining hard. What the city is allowed to do is actually divert a lot of the water through the tunnel under the city and discharging several miles downstream in the river, back in the river, right? And that is extremely important to protect the downtown against catastrophic flooding.
And ironically enough, if I remember correctly, I believe that project was finished right before the flood of 1998, which was a huge flood here in San Antonio.
That's right. It was right on the right timing, The infrastructure was tested and it works, right? But interestingly, too, people don't realize those flood control tunnels are extremely important for economic development, because sometimes we go through periods of extreme drought. And actually, we are living one of them right now, right? Bexar County has been in drought for at least 3 years, and we have seen droughts in other periods. But what the tunnel allows the city to do is actually to use the water from the San Antonio River and pump the water back into the Riverwalk. So if it wasn't for the tunnel, sometimes the Riverwalk might be dry. And can you imagine the impact that would have for tourism in the city? We receive thousands and sometimes millions of tourists every year that come to San Antonio to visit the Alamo and the missions and all that. It wouldn't be a nice experience if the Riverwalk was dry, right? So the idea of building the tunnel was extremely important and extremely smart, because it allows us to recirculate the water in that part of town. The water runs down the San Antonio River, enters the Riverwalk, keeps going down, and then we can actually pump the water, put in the tunnel, and bring it back. So it's an extremely important project for us.
And now that you think about it, I feel like every time I've been down there, minus the times that they go down there to clean out the debris that's in the Riverwalk, it's always the same level.
Yeah.
It never gets too high. It never gets too low. It is always remains a constant level, and that's pretty incredible.
Yeah. So the way the river is acting at that part is actually there are several gates that creates almost like what we call linear reservoirs, right? So we have ways to control the level pretty precisely because we can open or close those gates accordingly to the need for controlling the water level.
Well, outside of San Antonio, as you mentioned, the hill country, recently we did have another devastating flood that affected many lives, but you had a firsthand experience with it. Can you care to share your experience up in the hill country near Kerrville this past summer?
So every summer, my family get together and my parents-in-law decides to go to some place so we can enjoy time with them. And we end up renting an Airbnb near Kerrville on the weekend of the July 4th holidays. So I was there, with my family. Luckily, we were safe. We are not in Kerrville and we are not in a house by the Guadalupe River. We were a few miles from it in a smaller creek called the Turtles Creek. And it was a holiday, we were enjoying. I was totally unaware of weather forecasts. I turned off my professor researcher brain and I wasn't paying attention to the water whatsoever. So I went to bed, around 11 p.m. The rain started. And I actually felt like, wow, I'm going to sleep with the sound of the rain in the rooftop, that's nice. But it rained and it kept raining and it kept raining all night long. It was an extremely amount of rainfall. When I woke up next day, our house, as I said, was safe. We were elevated, but around all of us, there was extreme floods, and debris all over. And at that time in the morning, I couldn't grasp of how bad it was. I knew there was a lot of rain. But then, unfortunately, the news start popping up on your phone, and when we realized that it was catastrophic. As soon as I got close to the river, I realized that how bad it was. When you see all the devastation to the floods, the first image that comes is war, to be honest, But as soon as I got back home, I realized, as an expert on this topic, I need to start studying this and try to understand what really happened, and what are the things that maybe we could do to avoid that in the future.
So what are some of the things that you saw early on? Obviously, when it comes to weather, there's a lot that is uncontrollable, but I'm sure that there are elements on the engineering side of things that are controllable.
Well, there's always engineering solutions, right? The question becomes, is the engineering solution economically viable and environmentally responsible, right? So in the case of the Upper Guadalupe River and Kerrville communities, I think what we can do best is to reevaluate how we're using the floodplain, which means how close people are living to the river itself, right? And we have enough data to show that there's quite a lot of communities, and homes that are too close to the river. And that's understandable. People like the river. I mean, the river is so beautiful, right? Who doesn't want to live by that amazing future, But the problem is that sometimes, some very rare rain event can happen, as it happened last year. And that was extremely rare, but it did, right? So we measure probabilities of rainfall happening in particular locations, actually in the entire United States, through a function called what we call intensity, duration, frequency curves. And those are amounts of rain that happens for a particular duration, for a particular probability. But we know the probability is kind of hard to communicate. So engineers invented this idea of a return period. So instead of telling your probability of an event happening, we say, on average, if that event happens again, how many years that event would happen on average, right? So that's where it comes that term of 100-year floods or 500-year floods, right? And we use those probabilities, those return periods, to design infrastructure. This particular event, in some locations on the south fork of the Upper Guadalupe, NOAA has estimated that that event was more than a 1,000-year event. So it was extremely extreme, it never happened before. And unfortunately, there were too many people too close to the river. Another aspect that contributed for the disaster was the fact that it happened at night where people were sleeping. And in the end, the result was, extreme. There's so many loss of life. So the focus now should be in trying to understand what happens, which I think we do, and now come up with solutions that can alert people and to make people more aware that flash floods can happen at any time, and they need to have a plan to what to do if they are warned that a flash flood is coming. So there are now investments from the state and I think from local communities that might take advantage of starting to build alert systems, right? That can, through sirens or maybe better communication. One thing that we learned, I think, is that because of the storm, many cell towers lost power and people lost cell service. So they were not aware, they couldn't even be reached, especially at that time of the night. So alerting people is something that is extremely important, and there's quite a lot of research happening now on how can we predict better if the flood is coming. We do have, meteorological models, and the National Weather Service do, based on meteorological computations, and very complex weather models to try to predict how much is going to rain and when. But there is still a lot of the physics of extreme events that meteorologists don't really understand yet. So it's hard. That type of event that happened, it was very hard to predict with several hours in advance. And that was one of the reasons why not much action was taken, because when the alerts came, it came almost too late.
I did want to ask, especially from your engineering mindset, the definition of a 100-year flood, does that evolve over time?
Yes, unfortunately it does, for two reasons. When we build those curves that I mentioned, the intensity, duration, frequency curves, they are based on historical records. So as we collect more data, those curves change. This is one aspect. The other one is climate change. We know for sure that climate change is increasing the severity, and the intensity of extreme events. Some places more than the others. There is some uncertainty of how much, but we know that due to climate change, those things are becoming more frequent and more intense. So there is no doubt that the 100-year flood from 10 years ago is smaller than the 100-year flood from today. Just to give you an example, when I joined UTSA, we used to have 24 hours, 100-year storm that we used for design in San Antonio. It was 10 inches in 24 hours. So after Hurricane Harvey happened in Houston, then we recalculated those numbers, and now it's more than 12. So that means that the infrastructure that we built in the past for the 100-year storm, which was 10 inches, now needs to probably handle 12. So those infrastructures are then not properly designed for what's happening now and probably not properly designed for what's happening in the future. Obviously, as engineers, we always put some legal room, some what we call free board to try to account for those things. But we certainly need to start thinking about more resilient infrastructure that can observe not only storm events that are designed for a particular probability for now, but also come up with ways. And there's a lot of research and a lot of smart engineers and researchers are trying to figure out ways to do that.
In addition to your research on flooding, I know that you've explored the effects of stormwater and the impact pollutants have on our aquifer, the Edwards Aquifer. Can you elaborate on this research a little bit more and explain why we should be paying closer attention to this?
Yes. So the rain itself, it's a blessing, right? It's a natural phenomena, and we need rain because we need water, not only as human beings and living beings, but as a community and society. Water is extremely important for economic development and many other activities. What happens, though, is when we build infrastructure and we develop communities, we alter the natural way for which the water runs through a particular area, right? We alter what we call hydrological cycle. What happens is before, when the land is native, for instance, right, or it rains and part of the water actually infiltrates into the ground, right? And this is important, specifically where we are, because we are on top of the recharge zone of the Edwards Aquifer, which is the major water source for the whole region, right? And the more rain that infiltrates, less water will surface runoff and become, water running through creeks and rivers and all of that. The problem is that when we develop a particular area, we use a lot of impervious materials, right? Rooftops with metal, or roadways with asphalts and concrete, lots of concrete, right? What happens is that we alter then the hydrological regime. More runoff is generated, less water infiltrates. And on top of that, there is an aspect of water quality as well. Impervious surfaces over time in our cities starts accumulating pollutants from different activities, from the atmosphere or from cars and many other sources. So when the rain comes, the water from rain becomes surface runoff and wash off all those pollutants, and they become concentrated in particular parts of the city. And that can become a real problem for not only nature, ecosystems, but it could contaminate our major water sources as well. So that's why stormwater management is so important, not only to control the amount of water or extra runoff that is generated in development that can cause flooding, for instance, when we have too much rain, but also we need to take care of water quality, because that amount of pollution might eventually harm our environment and harm ourselves if we are not paying too much attention for that.
So what kind of common pollutants are you observing? Did you ever find anything that was unexpected or surprising to you?
Yeah, so in this project, we evaluated the typical water quality parameters that we see. The most important one is called the total suspended solids, which are small particles of sand or clay or dust. And those are important because they act as almost like a surrogate for other pollutants as well, because many different chemicals can actually attach to particles like that. So we evaluated total suspended solids, but we have seen other things like loads of bacteria, which is a real problem for many creeks in San Antonio. We have several creeks that are impaired due to excess of bacteria. We also look at heavy metals. And we also look at some of the hydrocarbons that would expect that might come from a parking lot. And surprisingly, we in this project couldn't find hydrocarbons at all. There might be some reasons for that. The fact that those systems are relatively new. Also, we have evidence that cars nowadays are leaking less oil than they used in the past. So we haven't seen much evidence of oils running from those systems. So that was a good surprise, actually, But associated with total suspended solids, there might be other things like nutrients. The chemistry of the water might be altered. So we look at different aspects of different pollutants, and different systems perform differently with respect to some pollutants to respect to the others, too.
And those pollutants were generally found from what? What was the cause of those pollutants?
So heavy metals typically would come from cars, brake pedals, for instance, or pads. There is also atmospheric deposition naturally that comes from the atmosphere, and there's many different sources that would bring some of those things to cities, power plants, other types of industries. There might be local erosion as well. Some materials and soils running off from landscaped areas. All of those things can end up reaching the surface runoff.
Well, I hope our listeners have learned just as much as I have from this conversation. But I did want to ask you, what is one thing that you would like for our listeners to leave with? Something to be mindful of, or maybe more aware of going into the future about how we manage stormwater or managing flooding in our community?
The one important thing is that I think people need to be mindful is that floods are natural phenomena, and floods has always happened, right? We know that they're becoming more intense and more extreme. So one of the things that I would urge people to think of is, regardless of how much certainty or uncertainty we have about the future, we need to be smart of how we build communities and how we protect ourselves against natural hazard events such as floods in the future. So for instance, if you're going to purchase a property, ask yourself, do you think this property can eventually suffer from flooding or not? And we have enough information for people to look. We generate several products, including floodplain maps that are published by FEMA, to help people to understand and better grasp what is the risk that their personal risk that they have against flooding. Not only their property, but where people move, right? And unfortunately, Bexar County is one of the leaders in flood fatalities due to people driving in low water crossings. I know that when you're driving, you really want to get home as fast as possible, especially when it's raining. But if you are in a particular road and you see in front of you a low water crossing, water running off through the pavement, really stop and think whether you can drive through or not. It doesn't require much water to actually, wash off a car out of a pavement. It's just enough, an inch of a foot or 12 inches of running water in a certain velocity to take a car or a big truck and move out of the pavement. So this is one very important aspect that I think people need to be mindful. You think that, I have a big truck, it's very heavy, I can cross over it. But guess what? Your big trucks have big tires. Those tires are buoys, those tires are going to float your car. So this is one of the things I would urge people to think about. Be aware and try to better understand what are their personal risks due to flood events that might happen.
Well, that's a great note to leave on. Dr. Giacomoni, I really appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us today, and I hope you enjoyed this as well.
Absolutely. My pleasure to be here. Very happy to talk to you.
This episode of Launchpad is brought to you by the Office of University Strategic Communications at the University of Texas at San Antonio. Make sure you subscribe to our channel right now, and for more great content, click right here.